Listen, what we have facing us coming up this year is critical to the future of the country. I think we all know that. We've been able to change this country with virtually no money, because that's not what it takes. It takes resolve, it takes people who want to work hard, and it takes that eternal vigilance.
But I just want to say before I get Jack to come up here, it's extremely important. His election victory and Lee Zeldin's election victory gave us a voice in Albany that is extremely important and is going to have massive impact. And I want him to come up right now, Jack, if you could. Give us a little rundown on what's going on and where we stand on some of these issues. And now Jack's in a hurry tonight, so, you know, we're not going to give him the bum's rush, but I'm going to mediate questions after we're done so we can try and get him on the way. All right?
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How are you?
All right.
It's great to be here. Mine was the election that wasn't decided until the Court of Appeals decided my election on December 20th by certifying the election, and we won by 451 votes. And by winning by 451 votes, we had nearly 86,000 people vote. There are 17,000 more registered Democrats in my district than Republicans. There are 30,000 registered independents, a nearly two-term incumbent, and we were able to win, and we were able to win because of you. And there are no doubts about that. We had a tremendous amount of support from this organization and from many of you in the room today. And if you consider 451 votes in the context of a senatorial district that has 311,000 residents, it kind of puts everything into context. And when you consider the realities of 451 votes, in light of the promise that the former president or majority leader of the New York State Senate made, which was that if they held on to the majority of the Senate, the Democrats would redistrict the Republican Party into oblivion in New York State, then you realize that 451 votes was the difference between New York State and the Republican Party in New York State maintaining fiscal discipline or handing everything over to the Democrats for generations to come. And for that, I thank you for your help. Talk about a couple of things that have happened this year, and I preface everything by saying, remember the last 2 years. Both federally and here in New York State, remember the last 2 years. Last 2 years, federally and in New York State, everything was a question of raising taxes, raising fees, and they didn't care that we were in the middle of a recession in New York State. They raised taxes and fees by $14 billion these past 2 years. This year, we were able to pass a budget. Not only was it passed on time, but we were able to cut $10 billion worth of spending and balance a budget, which is an incredible thing when you consider it in New York State. For the first time, we actually looked to cut, and many of you live here, Nassau County, Suffolk County, it really doesn't matter. You heard the attacks. I heard Stephen refer to it just a few moments ago. People are asking us to raise taxes, extend the millionaire's tax. Anyone know what that millionaire's tax is? Millionaire's tax. Over $200,000. If you make over $200,000, they wanted us to tax you in order to increase spending in New York State. We've said it before, we don't have a revenue problem in New York State, we have a spending problem in New York State. We cut spending first, and we did. And we didn't raise taxes, and we stayed true to our commitment, and I think that was an important first step, and it showed that we had turned the corner in New York State. If nothing else, we were going to make it a priority to live within our means, and you saw that in the budget that was ultimately adopted. But that's just the first step. Now we have to work on this tax cap. The governor proposed a tax cap back in January. It was his first program bill for the year. And the day it was proposed, I'll let you know a little secret, before it was proposed, the Senate had put it on the agenda. We were going forward with a tax cap on our own. We weren't waiting for the governor. He called us and said, I don't want you to move forward on your cap. I want you to adopt mine because I think it would be more appropriate that it come from, in this case, from the governor's office. So we held off on ours. We worked out the language to work out the discrepancies between the two, and we moved forward with the governor's tax cap, and we passed it the very same day. Then what happened? Then we waited. Then we waited. And an interesting thing happened. They kept talking about how we were holding up the tax cap and how the Senate wasn't really committed to the tax cap. But we had passed it. Now, does anyone know who the sponsor is of the tax cap, the governor's program bill in the Assembly? Who was the sponsor of the governor's program bill on the tax cap?
Sheldon Silver.
Sheldon Silver. And usually, as things work out, in the Senate, if I want something, one of my bills to reach the floor, I go talk to the majority leader. In the Assembly, if you want one of your bills to reach the floor, who do you go talk to?
The sponsor.
You go talk to the Speaker of the Assembly. So, in this case, if the sponsor of the bill had spoken to the Speaker of the Assembly, maybe while he was shaving in the morning, he may have been able to get the bill on the floor if he really was interested in doing that. And he didn't. And we heard about this tax cap that was proposed earlier this week. Now, I don't understand what the governor is doing, I truly don't. But I do know that there are things that we have to do between now and the end of session, which is rapidly approaching. And one of the priorities that we have is to insist that we get this tax cap done, and we get a tax cap done that makes sense for us. Because ultimately, we do have to impose fiscal discipline, even if it means by putting a hard cap on local governments and school districts in New York State. We can't continue to spend at the rate that we have. We held a press conference this past week out here, or out in Suffolk County, in Lee Zeldin's district. Some of you may have seen it. You may have seen references to it. A homeowner bought their house back in 8 years ago. $6,000 they were paying in taxes 8 years ago. Today they're paying over 11. And we can repeat that in every community across Long Island. It's unsustainable. You can't do it. Right? We need to impose fiscal discipline. Unfortunately, it's come to that point, and we're prepared to do it. So I do expect that we're going to move forward on that as we move forward. Now, you're going to hear a lot of things about horse trading in Albany. Just understand something, and keep this in mind. Tax cap is a priority. Okay. The Speaker is going to want to talk about rent regulations. He's going to want to talk about how he wants the tax cap to sunset and to be renewed every 5 years simultaneously with rent regulations. Let it play out. Let it play out. Ultimately, it will have to work out. But you don't tie two different concepts together and expect to have a good result at the end. Shelley Silver earlier today said that these two concepts, tax cap and rent regulations, will be inextricably entwined forever. It's not going to happen. So let it play out. Tax cap's a priority. Let me just tell you a little bit about what I'm doing in the Senate. I chair local governments. That means I have oversight of villages, towns, counties, and districts. So there's a lot of things that come into play when we talk about these things. A lot of the things that come into play with respect to the tax cap also involve all of those layers of local government. So we've been very active over the last 4 or 5 months as it comes to these things. There's a bill that we recently proposed and was passed in the Senate. It involves consolidation. Some of you may have heard about it. The governor had a consolidation bill that was passed 2 years ago that had people voting on consolidation and dissolution without having a plan before them. Frankly, I believe that you have to have a plan and something to vote on before you ask somebody to cast the vote on something. It's not based on innuendo and rumors. Now, some questions that came up having to do with time limits. Petitioning process, how long do you have to get signatures and the like. Let me just tell you, we are amending the bill. It's being amended in the Assembly as well. It's being expanded. Originally, it was 60 days to get signatures. It's being expanded to either 120 days or 180 days to give enough time so that, frankly, that wasn't the point of this bill. The point of this bill was to make sure that people had a plan in front of them before you asked them to vote on dissolving or consolidating a piece of government. They needed to know whether or not there were actually going to be savings involved in that. So the time limits were less relevant. They're being expanded either to 120 or 180 days. I forget right now, and I apologize, but it's going to be expanded. And the time limit within which you have to prepare the plan originally was up to 2 years. It's being brought back to under a year. So 9 months with an extension for another 3 months in case they need it. So I think these are reasonable accommodations. There were concerns, certainly, that we heard from members of the community. It makes a lot of sense. The bills were negotiated with the New York Conference of Mayors and with the Association of Towns and with various districts. These are numbers that were consistent with other laws that they had proposed in the past. They weren't set in stone. They were passed. We got feedback. We're amending them. Happy? It's important, and certainly, I'll say it because it's important that you do that. Your senators here on Long Island, all 9 of us, we're accessible. Pick up the phone, call us. Some of you may have our cell phone numbers. Pick up the phone, call us. If there's something we're doing that you don't like, call us, tell us. We may not realize that we're doing something that is perhaps being interpreted in a bad way. Okay, we're here to represent you. And I said the same thing, to my community back when I was mayor. Knock on my door, pick up the phone, give me a ring. Certainly, we're prepared to hear all sides, and if I made a mistake, I'm more than willing to accept the fact that we made a mistake, and if it makes the law or the bill that much better, that's what it's all about. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. MTA payroll tax, very important issue. Continues to be a very important issue. I will give credit to my colleague out here in Suffolk County, or out in Suffolk County, excuse me. Keep thinking we're out in Suffolk because we're usually there. Out in Suffolk, Lee Zeldin. Lee has really taken a lead when it comes to the MTA payroll tax. He's taken the lead for literally for all of us on Long Island. He dove in right from the get-go, and certainly we rely on him when it comes to these things. There are other alternatives that are being proposed. Certainly, the senators from the lower Hudson Valley, who are also affected by the payroll tax, are equally concerned. The question is, how do we move forward and deal with these issues in a way that is going to result in us having a solution? It is a priority for all of us. We have met. I meet with the Nassau County delegation and with the Long Island delegation every week, apart from meeting with everyone else every day we're in session. All of the Republican members of the Senate conference every day that we're in session before we go out to session to coordinate, to discuss issues amongst ourselves. But we on Long Island also conference when we have these discussions, and certainly I can tell you that it is a priority for all of us. It's a priority for the majority leader, for Dean Skelos, that we come up with a solution in the midst of everything else that we're dealing with. I've answered more questions, well, I'm not going to say than any other issue, because there is another issue out there that we've heard even more questions about, and we'll get to that in a moment. But we've heard a lot of questions about the MTA payroll tax. We are committed to getting this done. It is not something that we have exclusively within our control to decide to eliminate the tax. It's not something we're going to do on our own, but we certainly are prepared to move forward, and it is going to be something that we're committed to getting done. So I can leave you with that. There are alternatives out there. None of them are great. The best alternative I've heard is just to eliminate the tax and let the MTA figure out how to make their ends meet, so to speak. But there are things that we have to do, and certainly building consensus is part of our responsibility. I will tell you this, and I don't mean this any other way than the way I'm saying it. If we hadn't elected 2 bodies, and we didn't elect them, I know that, but I'll just say it. If we hadn't elected Democrats to the majority in the Senate and the Assembly, that would never happen. I can guarantee you that. The fact that it passed at a time when they control both houses and the governor's office is a testament to the kinds of things that they can do when they control all layers of government. It was absurd and should have never happened. The federal government wouldn't even do that, but they did it here in New York. So it'll take us some time, but we will fix it. You can have my word on that. I see some hands up. Let's answer some questions. Yes, sir.
I heard one of the possibilities is to replace the MTA tax with a bridge tax over the East River. That would be an additional tax, plus the city is planning to go to congestion pricing, which would put an unnecessary burden on people who have to pass through New York City, whether they're commuters or they're travelers or they're truck drivers or whatever.
I agree with you.
I've heard 2 Republicans locally speak in terms of the idea that we cannot just do away with the MTA tax unless we give them an alternative source of income. Whatever happens to the idea of forcing the MTA to undergo thorough scrutiny to find out where the mismanagement and waste is before we even talk about anything like imposing a new tax to replace an old one?
Sir, I agree with you. Absolutely. Think about it this way, and this is the way, frankly, a number of us, and I know some people may have commented on that in the past, but I think they have learned the error of their ways, because we have had these discussions internally as well. It is inconceivable that we, as residents here on Long Island, would have to pay at every access point or exit point from Long Island. If we toll those East River crossings, that means that we will have to pay every time we come onto Long Island or we leave Long Island, and that's not acceptable. It just doesn't make sense. There are other ways of doing it. I'll give you an example, and these are the things that sometimes come up. The MTA received about $1 billion worth of its funding from the transfer tax. Transfer tax is a fee that's paid by a seller when they sell a home. And a portion of that tax went to fund the MTA. Why they would use a transfer tax from real property to fund the MTA makes absolutely no sense. It's not stable enough because in a downturn in the economy, as we've seen over the last 4 years, they've lost $1 billion worth of revenue from that one revenue stream. So one of the things that we have to think about is how is the MTA being funded so that it does survive the volatility of the economy and that we can continue to provide funding without undermining its ability to do its job. So what they substituted the transfer tax with was the MTA payroll tax. Since the MTA was not achieving the revenues that it expected because we had a downturn in the economy, and the state had tagged this particular tax and others that were economy driven, what was their solution? It wasn't a forensic audit of the MTA, which I think is long overdue. It was to just find another revenue stream. And before we go out and find another revenue stream, you're absolutely right. We need to go back and take a look at how the MTA funds itself. Does anyone know how much the MTA's budget is annually?
I know what their assets are, $59 billion.
$59 billion.
What do they do with those assets?
Does anybody know what their budget is annually? It's about $14 billion. It's about $14 billion. No, $59 billion in capital assets. They own buildings in New York City. They consider all of the platforms they own, all the subway stations they own, all of the stations that they own out here on Long Island and upstate and in Metro North. All of that put together is about $59 billion. And one of the questions we've asked as well is, why is the MTA in the real estate business? And you're absolutely right. The MTA should not be in the real estate business. That's not what they do. So let's get the MTA to focus on its core job or core requirements. But let's think about one thing. The MTA was put together in order to create efficiencies. Through consolidation, that the MTA would be able to create efficiencies and we'd be able to have synergy between Metro North, Long Island Railroad, the subway system, and the bus systems. And perhaps, and this is another thing, a concept that is being discussed as well, is perhaps the MTA needs to be broken up. And maybe the MTA needs to be broken into its components and allowed to fend for itself. So there are things out there that are being discussed. Yes, sir. Unfortunately, it has been recently. Yes, sir. How are you?
With respect to the tax cap, I'm hearing and reading and seeing on various news shows and all that, that there's carve-outs out of that tax cap. And one of them was that they want to leave the pensions alone for all the city workers or whatever it was. And so they're diluting the whole thing as to its original form.
Right.
Can you speak to it?
Sure. One of the carve-outs that was recommended or suggested, it exists in the Assembly bill, it doesn't exist in the Senate bill, was for any pension increases above 2%. Now, what does that mean? Right now, pensions, let's say, are 15% of your overall, it's actually about 16 or 17% of your payroll. So 16 or 17% of your payroll goes towards paying contribution for your pension. If that goes up 2%, that rate goes from 16% to 18%, that 2% would be exempt. Anything above that 2% would be exempt from the cap. It's only happened twice in the last 20 years. It is not just 2%. It's actually a pretty significant number, but it's not the cap that we had passed in the Senate. So this is what they're proposing as an alternative. It is going to be negotiated, but I want everyone to understand that even what they're proposing is not as loose as I read in Newsday this morning that pensions are exempt. They're not exempt. And I just want to make that clear. Most of our municipalities are service organizations. We're salary driven. So salaries are normally 70, 75%. If you look at your school districts, you look at your villages, your counties, your towns, they're salary driven. If it goes up 2%, that is a significant portion of the amount under the cap, which requires them to be, I guess, at least show a little more fiscal discipline. It's better than the alternative. Certainly isn't as good as the bill that we passed. One thing I will tell you this, we had some people who came up to Albany to meet with us about 2 weeks ago. I will tell you this. We are committed to a cap this year. We're committed to a hard cap this year. People were talking about, well, why don't we negotiate rent regs for the tax cap? Because we don't have to. Okay? And trust me when I tell you, there are going to be discussions this year through the balance of this year where it's going to involve discussions, and they're going to try and tie the rent regs back in. We're not going to negotiate in public. We can't. But just understand that a cap is a significant priority for us. Just as not raising taxes and not raising fees was a significant priority for us when we went into this budget process. And guess what? No taxes, no increased fees. We'll do the right thing. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'm going to take any action about the stupidity that exists in government that causes a lot of these problems in the first place. Like when they wanted to save money, encourage teachers to take early retirement so they lose the pension income and start having to pay on pensions, more pensions, and earlier and over a longer period of time. And then they wonder why they get into the problems they get into. They set things up, and then maybe it's sound, maybe it's not when it's set up. But then they start making changes, and they make sure that it becomes totally unsound, and we end up with the mess we're in. And nobody even addresses those problems, and they still propose them as solutions.
You're right. I'll give you another example. Back in 2000, the state decided that they were going to do away with employee contributions to the state pension system. 2000. Tier 3 and Tier 4 employees were required to contribute to their pensions. Actuarially, it was a 3% requirement for their entire employment. In 2000, the legislature, at the urging of the comptroller at the time, a guy by the name of Cole, decided that they would do away with a 3% contribution after the first 10 years. So that people would contribute to their pensions when they were earning the least amount, but they would be paid out on their pensions based on their highest earning capacity. And yes, if you don't have employees contributing to the pension system, who does that leave?
Us.
The taxpayers. And that's one of the examples, and that is a really dumb thing for them to have done. I agree with you, sir. That is an example. Yes, ma'am.
I was speaking to the director of the Medical Society, and he mentioned to me that almost redesign program, what happens is that the malpractice cap was stopped, and yet heard it was from a Democrat who was friends with Cuomo, who's a malpractice attorney, and that's why it was squashed. And medical doctors all over New York was very upset, as well as across the country. Could you explain to me about that?
I can tell you that the Senate in our one House bill included it. The governor had made a commitment that he was going to support it. He made that commitment through the Medicaid redesign team to the hospitals, and then he turned his back on it. So.
Is there anything that can be done in terms of, I was talking to Mr. Plainview, doctors from across the country that are very interested in doing whatever they can. Just in New York State, if there's anything that can be done, giving us ideas, whatever the doctors will be behind something.
Sure. I
Ideas, what they recommend, anything wrong.
I-
They're coming to me in the hospital, that's what's going on.
which hospital?
Long Island Jewish.
Okay,
It's the North Shore Health System, it's the entire health system.
Oh, I understand. I have North Shore LIJ, Winthrop, and St. Francis in my district. And certainly, I hear from all the doctors and from the hospitals themselves with regard to the impacts to them every day. The only thing we can do is take it up again, and hopefully through another similar type process. It's not going to happen this year. The governor has already indicated that it's not going to happen. But perhaps through the next budget cycle, it can be revisited again. My question, and my point, and really, if you want to go to Long Island Jewish and North Shore and go to Michael Dowling, who chaired the Medicaid redesign team, my question to the hospital has always been, why didn't you get that commitment firmed up before you allowed them to move the process forward? You remember when the Medicaid redesign team made their proposal, everybody was on board. All the hospitals were on board, the SEIU was on board, everybody was on board because there was an agreement that was reached. The SEIU got theirs, right? The hospitals didn't get theirs. And so part of my question back to the hospitals and to the administrators was, how'd you allow yourself to be put in that position? Because when push came to shove, we advanced it in our bill. We were there. The governor, unfortunately, didn't see fit to.
The doctors don't want to have the hospital administrators, they want to do it themselves.
Well, that means they got to be part of that process as well.
Yeah, whatever they can do, let me know. They're very comfortable.
I appreciate that.
All right, one more question. Jack's got to go.
Well, gentlemen, well then, gentlemen did as well, but we'll take two. I'll take yours as well, please. Sir, go ahead.
Senator, I first met you back at your fundraiser before you were elected, and I was impressed then, and you haven't disappointed. And I want to thank you for all your hard work you've done. I'm trying to answer my question. And that sign behind you, we're behind you throughout this fight.
Thank you.
We're going to support this, and we're going to fight for you. My only question is, when you're dealing with the Assembly, we all know the nature of the Assembly as the Senate. But a lot of those assemblymen, they're from Long Island and from upstate New York. In dealing with them, has the fiscal reality sunk in at all? Is there any cracks? Is there any day-to-day when you're dealing with these people?
A very important thing happened this year. Very important thing happened this year, and that is that 9 additional Republican assemblymen and women were elected. I got to tell you, I can't underscore how important that was. They just passed a micro-stamping bill this past week.
Ooh.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Today.
I get it, trust me. But they struggled to get their votes because every Republican that you elect, whether it's out here on Long Island, whether it's throughout New York State, every Republican you elect will have the same view when it comes to decisions that are important to us. And so they're dealing with those issues now. How do we deal with them? We elect more Republicans, and hopefully there are enough conservative Democrats.
That's what I mean. Is there any Democrats? I mean, they're from Long Island, for Christ's sake. I mean, I
Trust
know
me.
they have a loyalty. Any bigoting, any...
We deal with them when we need to, and we do from time to time on issues.
They're scared, throw grandiose, they're in unison, lockstep, that they're going to throw scare tactics and demonizing, and typical Democrats, they're in lockstep, it's a wall. Even the fiscal reality doesn't matter to them. It's like they say, we're the ones who get our marching orders from the Koch brothers or whoever, but that's what you're up against every day. When
We deal with it every day. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
My question is in regard to the property tax cap.
Yes.
I come from a district that we just passed the 12.5 or 12.6% property tax increase.
For the school district. Where was that?
And I don't know, for young families such as mine, it's a struggle to stay on Long Island, and when we just put 12.5% increase, it's even worse. So there's been some rumors that even if they do pass this 2% tax cap, there will be some sort of concession on it, which will allow school districts to vote as to whether or not they wanted to opt out of
The threshold is 60%. The tax cap has a threshold to overcome is 60%.
So that is true.
Absolutely, there's a threshold on the tax cap. What it does is it requires that in the event that somebody, or that a district, school district, or that a municipality wants to override the tax, they have to do it with a supermajority rather than with a simple majority.
So how does that?
And let me just comment on communities and school districts like William Floyd, or like Westbury, or like Elmont, or which are the ones that I'm more familiar with, and I only know about William Floyd from my discussions with Senator Zeldin as well, because part of the concern is that when we do cut, and we as we said, we cut, and the cuts are, it's a blunt instrument, frankly. You cut across the board. But there are school districts out there that rely disproportionately on state aid. And William Floyd is one of them. Westbury School District's another. When I say disproportionately, I'll put it into context for you. If you go up to the Great Neck School District, they have a budget of about $190 million. They get about $3 million a year in state aid on that $190 million. When you go to Westbury, the Westbury School District has a school budget of $105 million, of which they get about $30 million in state aid. And there are a number of different reasons for that, and we can get back into formulas and how they compute that. William Floyd is in a position where they're similar to Westbury. So when you do cut state aid, the Westburys and the William Floyds are going to be disproportionately cut, and so those communities are going to have a greater impact from those cuts than some of the more affluent communities that are out there. And that's a reality that we have to deal with. And I'm just bringing it up to explain how you got to a 12% tax increase, even though on top of that 12%, they also had to cut programs, lay off teachers, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, you're correct. But what I don't understand is how is it benefiting to have a tax cap when these school districts are just going to use the normal scare tactics of if you don't give us $10 million more per year, we're going to cut $20 million worth of services to make you suffer.
I understand. What was the percentage? What was the percentage by which William Floyd passed their budget this year?
Passed their budget by 15 votes. 15 votes.
It would not have passed under a tax cap. It would not have reached the 60% requirement. It would not have reached that requirement. It forces the answer to your question is that it would not have hit that point. Westbury failed. Westbury School District failed their budget. William Floyd, you passed by a certain number of votes. If there was a 60% requirement, it would have failed. And the school district would have had to have come back and realistically reduced it. What the tax cap does, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Everybody knows about contingency budgets, right? And how sometimes the contingency budget is actually the same thing as the budget, sometimes higher, but sometimes, usually it's the same thing as the thing you just voted down. Under the tax cap, you go out with the vote in May. At least the way that the Senate has proposed, and I understand that it's somewhat similar in the one that the Assembly just recently proposed. You go out with your budget in May. If it's above the 2% cap, they need 60% in order for it to pass. If it doesn't pass, they get to go out with it one more time. If they go out again above the 2% cap, again, they need 60%. If they go out below the 60%, the 2% cap, they need 50%. They need a simple majority. But if it's above, again, they need 60%. If it fails again, if either one of them fails, or excuse me, if both of them fail, whether they go below or above, the end result is there's no contingency anymore. The contingency is zero year to year. And that's the hammer. And that's the hammer. If you consider the impact of that, there really is teeth now. When you decide to go out and vote down a budget, the difference year to year is zero. And it forces the school districts to have to deal with that reality when they deal with budgeting.
Why shouldn't that be the contingency budget?
That is the contingency budget under this tax cap. The contingency budget. I just got here. I can talk to you about the last 5 months, but I can't.
We're gonna have to end that now, guys. We're out of time, right?
thank you very much. As I've said in the past, please stay in touch. Feel free to reach out if there are things, and again, you're going to hear us misspeak, perhaps get things wrong. Give us a call, let us know. One last point. I said that the MTA payroll tax was the second most calls I get, right? The most calls I've gotten, by far. The phones are ringing off the hook. What is it? Same-sex marriage, gay marriage. It is. You have no idea. At a time when we're in a recession, where we're trying to spur the economy, when we're trying to create jobs, when we're focusing on fiscal discipline, that's what is ringing. Those are the calls that keep our staff busy day in and day out. For both sides, I believe in traditional marriage. Thank you.
And by the way, Jack changed his plans to be here tonight. He was in Albany this morning, so.